Welcome. Be sure to like and subscribe for more scary stories, or I will come for you. I'd like to thank Bree Bolton for rejoining the Curator's Disciples. Your viewership is very much appreciated. If anyone would like early access to my latest stories and an ad-free listening experience, consider becoming one of the Curator's Disciples. The link is in the description below. Today's video is a single long-form story. It may be a little longer than usual, but no less fucked up. Enjoy. Story number 1. The Livestock Experiment by the Curator. I never imagined my life would take such a dark and twisted turn. If you knew me a few years ago, you'd never guess I'd end up here. My name is Maya Carter, and I've always been a seeker of truth. I wasn't born into a family of journalists or investigators. In fact, my upbringing was pretty unremarkable. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and life moves at a slower pace. My parents were good people, hardworking, honest, and content with the simple life. My dad was a vet, and my mom ran a small bakery. They were the type of people who believed in the American dream, that if you worked hard and kept your head down, good things would come your way. But I was different. Even as a kid, I had this burning curiosity, a need to know the why behind everything. I wasn't satisfied with just accepting things as they were. I wanted to dig deeper, to uncover the stories that no one else was telling. When I was 10, I remember stumbling upon an old, dusty box in the attic filled with my grandfather's belongings. He was a war correspondent during World War II, a man who risked his life to bring back the truth from the front lines. As I sifted through his faded letters, yellowed newspaper clippings, and black and white photographs, something inside me clicked. I knew then that I wanted to follow in his footsteps, to be the voice that brought hidden truths to light, no matter the cost. After high school, I moved to the city to study journalism, much to my parents' dismay. They wanted me to pursue something safe, something stable, but I had bigger dreams. College was tough. I had to work 2 part-time jobs to pay for tuition, and my grades were nothing to brag about. But I was relentless. I took every opportunity to write, to investigate, to learn from the best. By the time I graduated, I had a few internships under my belt, and a reputation for being the girl who wouldn't take no for an answer. My first job out of college was at a small local newspaper. It wasn't exactly the big break I had hoped for, but it was a start. I cut my teeth on mundane stories, local politics, community events, the occasional scandal. But I kept my eyes open for something more, something that would make a real impact. Then, about 5 years ago, I got my first big break. I uncovered a corruption scandal involving a city council member taking bribes from developers. It wasn't the most glamorous story, but it was enough to get me noticed. My piece led to an investigation, and eventually the councilman was forced to resign. It was a small victory, but it felt like the start of something bigger. From there, I moved on to bigger stories: corporate corruption, illegal arms deals, human trafficking. The more I dug, the more I realized how much darkness was lurking just beneath the surface of our society. I became obsessed with exposing these hidden horrors, no matter the risk. My work started getting attention, and before long, I was freelancing for major outlets, taking on assignments that no one else wanted. But it was never enough. There was always another story, another truth that needed to be uncovered. I started spending more and more time online, diving into the deep web, where the darkest corners of humanity lay hidden. It was there that I first heard whispers of something truly disturbing. Rumors about a dark website selling something unnatural. People in the most secretive forums were talking about organic human meat, like it was some kind of high-end delicacy for the wealthy and depraved. At first, I thought it was just another twisted internet rumor, but the more I looked into it, the more I realized there might be some truth to it. I found myself drawn to the idea of uncovering the story behind these whispers. If it was real, if this kind of operation actually existed, it would be the story of a lifetime. Something that could change the world, or at least shine a light on the horrors that most people preferred to ignore. I couldn't let it go. I had to know more. Using the skills I'd honed over the years, I started digging deeper into the dark web. It wasn't easy. I had to be careful, moving through encrypted channels, bouncing my IP address across multiple countries to avoid detection. After weeks of searching, I found a lead. It was a vague reference to a farm in a rural area, a place that didn't show up on any map. The more I looked into it, the more convinced I became that this was the real deal. I knew the risks, but I also knew I couldn't walk away from this. I packed my bags and left the city, heading out into the middle of nowhere, driven by the need to uncover the truth. The drive took hours, and as I got closer, the roads became narrower and more isolated. It was the kind of place where you wouldn't be surprised if you saw someone burying a body in the woods. When I finally arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the empty fields. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. The farm itself was nothing special. Just a cluster of old, run-down buildings surrounded by overgrown fields. But there was something off about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The whole place felt wrong. I parked my car a mile away and approached on foot, using the cover of darkness to hide my movements. As I got closer, I noticed that the farm wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. There were people moving around, shadows flitting between the buildings, and I could hear the low hum of machinery coming from somewhere underground. I needed a way in, and that's when I spotted it. A small group of workers heading towards one of the buildings. They were dressed in dirty overalls, and from the looks of them, they were locals, people who probably didn't ask too many questions about what was going on here. I waited until they disappeared inside before making my move. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest as I crouched in the shadows. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence of the night. The crunch of gravel underfoot, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves in the wind. The workers had disappeared inside the barn-like structure, and I knew this was my chance. I had no idea what I would find, but I was prepared for anything, or so I thought. Moving quickly and quietly, I crept towards the building. The air was thick with the smell of manure and something else, something metallic and sharp that I couldn't quite place. As I reached the side of the barn, I pressed my back against the cold, rough wood, taking a moment to steady my breathing. I could hear muffled voices inside, low and indistinct, but there was no time to decipher what they were saying. I needed to get inside and start gathering evidence. There was a small window near the back of the building, just high enough that I had to stand on tiptoe to peer through. The glass was dirty, smeared with grime, but I could make out shapes moving within. The interior was dimly lit by a few hanging bulbs, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the walls. I could see the workers milling about, but it was what lay in the center of the room that caught my attention. There, on a large metal table, was what appeared to be a body. A human body, covered by a stained, tattered sheet. My breath caught in my throat as I watched one of the workers pull back the sheet, revealing a pale, lifeless form beneath. My stomach churned at the sight. The body was that of a man, maybe in his 30s, his skin sallow and bruised. his eyes wide open and staring blankly at the ceiling. The workers moved with a grim efficiency, as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. One of them produced a large knife, its blade glinting in the dim light, and began to carve into the flesh with practiced precision. The sound of the blade slicing through skin and muscle made me gag, but I forced myself to keep watching, my mind racing with the implications of what I was witnessing. This was no ordinary farm. This was a place of death, a slaughterhouse for humans. The rumors I'd heard on the dark web were true. Horrifyingly, sickeningly true. I felt a wave of panic rise within me, but I knew I couldn't afford to lose my nerve. I had to get closer, had to find a way inside to document what was happening. This was the story of a lifetime, but only if I could survive long enough to expose it. I scanned the area for another entrance, my eyes landing on a small half-open door at the far end of the building. It looked like it led to a storage room or maybe a basement. Somewhere I could enter without being immediately noticed. I took one last look at the grisly scene inside before slipping around the corner and heading towards the door. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on the task at hand. The room I entered was small and cluttered, filled with old crates, tools, and what looked like bags of feed. The smell in here was even worse. Rotting meat mixed with the stench of decay, making it nearly impossible to breathe without gagging. I moved cautiously, my eyes scanning every shadow, every dark corner for signs of danger. I needed to find a place to hide, somewhere I could observe without being seen. That's when I noticed the trapdoor in the floor, partially concealed by a pile of sacks. My gut told me that whatever lay beneath would hold the answers I was looking for. The heart of this operation. With trembling hands, I moved the sacks aside and slowly lifted the trapdoor. A foul odor wafted up from the darkness below, causing me to recoil, but I steeled myself and began to descend the rickety wooden ladder into the abyss. The ladder creaked under my weight, each step sending a shiver of dread down my spine. As I descended into the darkness, the stench grew stronger, an overwhelming mix of blood, sweat, and fear. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat as I gripped the wooden rungs. I didn't know what I was about to find, but I knew it would be worse than anything I had ever imagined. The basement was dimly lit by a series of bare light bulbs strung haphazardly across the ceiling. The flickering light cast eerie shadows on the walls, creating a surreal, nightmarish atmosphere. The walls were lined with metal cages, each one filled with people. Men, women, and even children huddled together, their eyes wide with terror. They were emaciated, their skin pale and bruised, their clothes little more than rags. The air was filled with the sounds of sobbing, pleading, and the occasional moan of despair. I felt my stomach turn as I took in the sight. These were not just captives. They were livestock, raised and fattened for slaughter. The reality of what was happening here hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a story. It was a nightmare come to life. I moved through the basement, my heart heavy with dread. The cages stretched as far as the eye could see, a never-ending line of human misery. Some of the prisoners were too weak to even lift their heads, their eyes glazed over with hopelessness. Others reached out to me as I passed, their hands trembling, their voices barely more than a whisper. "Please, help us." Their pleas tore at my soul, but I knew there was nothing I could do for them. Not yet. I had to focus on gathering evidence, on finding a way to expose this atrocity to the world. But the longer I stayed in that basement, the more I realized how impossible that task would be. This operation was massive, a well-oiled machine that had been running for years, maybe even decades. How could one person hope to bring it down? I forced myself to keep moving, my eyes scanning the room for anything that could help me. That's when I saw it. A large metal door at the far end of the basement, guarded by two men armed with rifles. It was different from the other doors I'd seen, reinforced with heavy steel and secured with multiple locks. Whatever was behind that door, it was important. I needed to get closer, but the guards made that impossible. I would have to find another way to access whatever lay beyond. I backed away slowly, keeping to the shadows as I made my way back to the ladder. My mind was racing with possibilities, but every plan I came up with seemed doomed to fail. I was in over my head, and I knew it. As I climbed back up the ladder, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled with unease, but I forced myself to focus. I had to find a way into that room to uncover the final piece of the puzzle. When I reached the top, I carefully replaced the trapdoor and moved the sacks back into place. I couldn't afford to leave any evidence of my presence. Taking a deep breath, I slipped out of the storage room and back into the night, my mind racing with what I'd seen. I needed a plan, and I needed it fast. The next day, I returned to the farm under the cover of darkness. I had spent the entire day holed up in a nearby motel, poring over my notes and footage, trying to make sense of everything. I had enough evidence to blow the lid off this operation, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. I needed more, something definitive, something that would leave no room for doubt. As I approached the farm, I noticed something different. The workers were more active than usual, moving around with a sense of urgency that I hadn't seen before. My gut told me that something was about to happen, something big. I couldn't afford to miss it. I made my way back to the barn, slipping inside through the same door as before. The smell hit me like a freight train, a sickening mix of blood, sweat, and decay. I forced myself to push through it, to focus on the task at hand. The interior of the barn was just as I had left it, with the metal table still in the center of the room. But this time, there was no body on the table. Instead, the workers were gathered around a large metal crate, their faces tense with anticipation. I crept closer, trying to get a better view. The crate was about the size of a coffin, and it was filled with something. My heart raced as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just any crate. It was a transport container, the kind used to ship meat across the country. I watched in horror as the workers lifted the lid, revealing the body of a young woman inside. She was alive, but barely. Her skin was pale and bruised, her breathing shallow and labored. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, and I could see the terror in them, the realization that she was about to die. The workers didn't waste any time. They began to cut into her flesh, their movements methodical and precise. The woman's screams pierced the air, sharp and agonizing, echoing off the barn's walls. Her voice was raw with desperation. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin, my legs trembling as I fought the urge to look away. But I couldn't. I had to witness this, had to capture every second of this brutality to ensure the world would know the truth. The workers moved with disturbing efficiency, their faces emotionless as they sliced into her flesh. The blades sank into her skin with a sickening sound, the metallic scent of blood filling the air as they worked. It was as if they were butchers handling a piece of livestock, detached and unfeeling. I could see the life draining from the woman's eyes, her screams fading into weak gasps as her body went limp. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down, forcing myself to stay focused. My hands were shaking so badly that it was a struggle to keep the camera steady. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but I knew I couldn't. I had come here to uncover the truth, and that truth was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. As the woman's body went still, the workers continued their gruesome task. They carved into her with precision, stripping the flesh from her bones as if she were nothing more than an animal. I watched as they placed the flesh into large plastic bins, each piece meticulously weighed and inspected before being sealed away. It was a well-practiced routine, one they had clearly performed countless times before. This wasn't just murder, this was industry. These people were being harvested, processed, and packaged for sale like any other commodity. And it wasn't just the physical brutality that shook me to my core, it was the utter disregard for human life. These people weren't viewed as victims or even prisoners. They were products, raw material to be exploited for profit. The thought made my blood run cold. I knew I had to get out of there, to regroup and figure out my next move. But as I began to back away, I heard something that made my heart stop. One of the workers was speaking, his voice low and gruff. "We need to move the next batch to the prep room. Boss wants them ready by dawn." The prep room. I tried to make sense of what he was saying. I had to find this room, had to see what they were doing there. It was my only chance to gather the final piece of evidence I needed. But how could I get there without being caught? The guards were everywhere, and I had already pushed my luck by sneaking into the barn. One wrong move, and I'd end up just like the woman on that table. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I couldn't afford to hesitate. I had to act now, before they moved the batch and destroyed whatever evidence was in that room. With my heart pounding in my chest, I crept towards the back of the barn, keeping low and staying in the shadows. The workers were still focused on their gruesome task, too absorbed in their work to notice me slipping out of the door. Once outside, I pressed myself against the side of the building, scanning the area for any sign of the prep room. My eyes landed on another small structure a few yards away, partially obscured by trees. It was the only building I hadn't explored yet, and something told me that it was the place I was looking for. I moved quickly and quietly, keeping to the shadows as I made my way towards the building. My heart was racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I knew this was a risk, but I had no other choice. If I didn't get this footage, everything I had done would be for nothing. As I approached the building, I saw that the door was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out into the night. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. I knew that once I stepped inside, there would be no turning back. I pushed the door open slowly, wincing as it creaked on its hinges. The light inside was dim, casting long shadows across the room. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust, but when they did, the sight that greeted me was worse than anything I'd seen before. The room was small and sterile, with stainless steel tables lining the walls and bright surgical lights hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with tools, saws, scalpels, and instruments I couldn't even begin to identify, all meticulously arranged and gleaming under the harsh light. There was a cold, clinical air to the room, like a twisted operating theater. But it was the figures on the tables that truly horrified me. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, strapped down with thick leather restraints, their bodies riddled with fresh wounds. They were alive, but barely, their chests rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Their eyes were glazed with pain and fear, their mouths gagged to muffle any screams. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I realized what this room was for. This wasn't just a place to prepare bodies for sale. This was where they were tortured, mutilated, and broken before being butchered like livestock. The overseers didn't just want meat. They wanted to break their victims, to strip them of their humanity before ending their lives. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the camera, trying to capture every detail. The people on the tables were in agony, their bodies trembling with each shallow breath. I could see the fear in their eyes, the desperate plea for mercy that would never come. One of the men was missing several fingers, the stumps crudely bandaged and still oozing blood. The woman's face was a mess of bruises and cuts, her eyes swollen shut from the beating she had received. The third man had deep lacerations running down his arms, his skin flayed open in long, jagged strips. My presence here was a death sentence if I was discovered. I forced myself to stay focused, to keep filming as I moved closer to one of the tables. The man strapped down before me was in the worst condition. His body was a mass of cuts and burns, his skin charred in places where they had applied heat. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one a struggle as he fought to stay alive. His eyes were filled with a desperation I had never seen before, a primal fear that cut through me like a knife. I couldn't help but wonder who he was, what his life had been like before he ended up here. Did he have a family? Friends? What had he done to deserve this fate? The questions haunted me, but I knew I would never get the answers. My hands shook as I reached out to touch his arm, the heat from his burned skin searing against my fingers. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it would be okay, but I knew it would be a lie. There was no escape from this place, no mercy for those who ended up here. As I pulled my hand back, I noticed something on the man's wrist. A tattoo, partially obscured by the blood and grime. It was a small symbol, one I couldn't quite make out, but it seemed familiar somehow. I leaned in closer, trying to get a better look, when I heard the door behind me creak open. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Footsteps echoed through the room, heavy and deliberate, as someone entered. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare breathe, for fear that they would hear me. The person walked past me, their steps slow and purposeful as they approached the table. I could feel the tension in the air, the sense of impending doom. Whoever it was, they were here to finish the job. I watched in horror as a gloved hand reached out and grasped the man's chin, tilting his head up to examine him. The man whimpered, his body trembling as he tried to pull away, but the restraints held him firmly in place. The gloved hand squeezed tighter, the man's face contorting in pain. "It's time," a voice said, cold and devoid of any emotion. I recognized that voice. It was the same one I had heard earlier in the barn, the one giving orders to the workers. This was one of the overseers, the people in charge of this operation. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. The overseer released the man's chin and stepped back, giving a curt nod to someone out of my line of sight. I could hear the clinking of metal as another person stepped forward, holding a large syringe filled with a thick, amber liquid. The needle gleamed under the light, the liquid inside glistening like molten gold. I watched in morbid fascination as the needle was plunged into the man's arm, the amber liquid injected into his bloodstream. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The man's body convulsed, his eyes rolling back into his head as his muscles seized up. His mouth opened in a silent scream, his body thrashing against the restraints with such force that I thought they might break. But they didn't. The restraints held firm, keeping him locked tight to the table as the serum coursed through his veins. His skin turned a sickly shade of gray, veins bulging beneath the surface as the liquid spread throughout his body. I could hear the faint sound of bones creaking, muscles tearing under the immense strain. It was as if the serum was attacking him from the inside, breaking him down on a molecular level. The man's thrashing grew more violent, his limbs jerking in unnatural directions as the pain overwhelmed him. His eyes, once filled with desperation, were now blank and unseeing. The sound of his teeth grinding together was like nails on a chalkboard, a grating, unnatural noise that made my stomach churn. But the overseer showed no emotion, no hint of empathy for the suffering unfolding before them. They simply watched, their face expressionless as the man's body was consumed by the serum. It was clear that this was a test, a final, brutal experiment to push the limits of human endurance. The minutes dragged on, each second an eternity as the man's body continued to convulse. His skin began to split open in places, deep cracks forming as the pressure inside him became too much to contain. Blood oozed from the wounds, pooling on the table and dripping to the floor in a steady stream. I had to look away, the sight too much to bear. But even as I averted my eyes, the sounds of his suffering continued to echo in my ears. The wet, tearing noises of flesh being ripped apart, the muffled grunts and gasps as his body fought against the inevitable. It wasn't until the man's movements slowed, his body finally succumbing to the trauma, that the overseer stepped forward again. They placed a hand on his chest, feeling for a heartbeat, then nodded to their assistant. "Take him to the disposal," the overseer ordered. "He's finished." I watched in a daze as the assistant wheeled a gurney over to the table, unstrapping the man's lifeless body and transferring it onto the metal surface. His limbs flopped limply, his head lolling to the side as they secured him in place. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just witnessed. This was no ordinary slaughterhouse. This was a place of experimentation, where human beings were subjected to unimaginable horrors in the name of science, or perhaps something even darker. The overseer and their team were conducting tests, pushing the boundaries of what the human body could endure before it broke. And the man I had just seen was merely one of many. The other two figures on the tables were still alive, still strapped down and waiting for their turn. I couldn't imagine the terror they must be feeling, knowing that their fate was sealed, that they would soon face the same unimaginable torment. But I couldn't stay here any longer. The risk of being discovered was too great, and I had already captured more than enough footage to expose this operation for what it was. I needed to get out of this place. With one last glance at the poor souls still trapped in the prep room, I backed away slowly, keeping to the shadows as I made my way towards the door. My heart was pounding, every nerve in my body on high alert as I crept towards the exit. The overseer and their assistant were still focused on their grim task, oblivious to my presence. When I reached the door, I paused for a moment, listening for any sign of movement outside. The night was eerily quiet. The only sounds the faint rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant hum of machinery. It seemed safe, but I knew better than to trust appearances. I pushed the door open just enough to slip through, then quietly closed it behind me. The cool night air hit me like a wave, a stark contrast to the stifling heat and stench of the prep room. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves as I scanned the area for any signs of patrols. The compound was still, the guards likely stationed near the main building or the barn, where the workers were still processing the bodies. It was now or never. I had to make my move. The footage I had captured was damning, but getting it to the authorities would be a challenge. I couldn't go to the police. This operation was too big, too well connected. I had no doubt that there were people in power who were complicit in what was happening here. No, I had to be smart. I had to find a way to leak the footage without putting myself in immediate danger. But first, I had to get out alive. As I neared the fence, I crouched low, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The guards were nowhere in sight, and the only light came from the distant glow of the main building. My pulse quickened as I reached the fence, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. I was about to escape, but I was far from safe. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the small pair of wire cutters I had brought with me. My hands were trembling as I began to snip away at the chain links. The sound of the metal snapping under the pressure unnervingly loud in the stillness of the night. It took what felt like an eternity to create a hole large enough to squeeze through, but eventually I managed it. I glanced around one last time, then dropped to my stomach and wriggled through the gap in the fence. The rough metal scraped against my skin, but I didn't care. I was almost free. Once I was on the other side, I got to my feet and started running. I didn't look back, didn't stop to catch my breath. I just ran, the adrenaline pumping through my veins like fire. I had to get as far away from that place as possible, to put as much distance between myself and those horrors as I could. Eventually, I stumbled upon a dirt road, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. It stretched out in either direction, disappearing into the darkness, but it was the only path I could follow. I paused for a moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to decide which way to go. Instinctively, I turned left, figuring it would lead me away from the compound. The road was uneven, the surface littered with rocks and debris, but I didn't care. I just needed to keep moving, to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. My heart leapt in my chest, a mixture of hope and fear flooding through me. A vehicle could mean rescue, but it could also mean capture. I hesitated, listening as the sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from behind me, the rumble of tires on dirt unmistakable. My mind raced, weighing my options. I could hide, wait for the vehicle to pass, or I could risk flagging it down, hoping it was someone who could help me. But I was too exhausted to run any longer, too tired to keep going on my own. I needed help, and this might be my only chance. With a deep breath, I stepped into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically as the headlights came into view. The vehicle, a pickup truck, slowed as it approached, the driver clearly cautious. I could only hope they weren't involved with the compound, that they were just a passerby who would take pity on a desperate stranger. The truck rolled to a stop, a few feet in front of me, the engine idling as the driver's door creaked open. A man stepped out, his face shadowed by the brim of a baseball cap. He was tall, his frame broad and muscular, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of fear as he approached. "What the hell are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice gruff. I hesitated. There was something in his voice, a coldness that sent a shiver down my spine. But I was too exhausted, too desperate to care. I needed help, and this was my only chance. I need help," I stammered, trying to steady my voice. "Please, I was lost in the woods. I just need a ride out of here." The man studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his cap. Then he nodded, jerking his thumb towards the passenger side of the truck. "Get in," he said simply. Relief washed over me, and I hurried to the truck, my legs trembling with fatigue. I climbed into the passenger seat, the worn leather creaking under my weight. The man got back behind the wheel, and without a word, he put the truck in gear and started driving. "Thanks," I murmured, my eyelids growing heavy. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "No problem," the man replied, his tone oddly neutral. I glanced over at him, but his face was still hidden in shadow. Something about his demeanor, his lack of concern, set off alarm bells in my mind. But before I could dwell on it, He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small bottle. "You look like you've had a rough night," he said, unscrewing the cap. "Here, drink this. It'll help you relax." He handed me the bottle, and I took it without thinking, my hands shaking as I unscrewed the cap. The liquid inside was clear, with a faint, medicinal smell. I hesitated, the warning bells growing louder in my head, but I was so thirsty, so desperate for comfort, that I ignored them. I took a small sip, grimacing at the bitter taste, then took another. The man watched me closely, his eyes glinting in the dim light from the dashboard. "That's it," he murmured, his voice almost soothing. "Just relax." I felt a warmth spreading through my body, a heavy drowsiness that settled over me like a blanket. My vision began to blur, the edges of my consciousness fraying as the world around me started to fade. What did you give me?" I mumbled, my words slurring together. The man smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that sent a jolt of terror through me. "Just something to help you sleep," he said. "Don't worry, you're going to be taken care of." Panic surged through me, but my body refused to respond. My limbs felt like lead, too heavy to move. I tried to speak, to scream, but all that came out was a faint, pitiful whimper. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was the man's cold, unfeeling eyes and the twisted smirk on his face. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the cold. The air was frigid, biting into my skin like icy needles. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My arms and legs were bound, my body strapped to a cold metal surface. I was back in the facility. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, panic rising in my chest as I struggled against my restraints. But it was no use. The straps were too tight, holding me in place with an iron grip. I was trapped. "Ah, you're awake." The voice sent a chill down my spine. It was the overseer, standing over me with that same expressionless mask they had worn before. The man who had drugged me was beside them, his face now fully visible in the harsh light of the prep room. He wasn't just a random stranger. He was part of this operation, a hunter sent out to retrieve anyone who managed to escape. "I must commend you," the overseer continued, their voice cold and clinical. "Most don't make it as far as you did, but unfortunately, your little adventure ends here." I thrashed against the table, desperation clawing at my throat, but my movements were weak, sluggish. The drug was still in my system, dulling my senses and making it impossible to fight back. The overseer nodded to their assistant, who stepped forward with a syringe filled with a thick amber liquid. My heart pounded in my chest as they approached, the needle glinting ominously in the fluorescent light. "This won't take long," the overseer said, almost as if they were trying to comfort me. "You'll be helping us continue our work. A valuable contribution, really." I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but all that came out was a strangled sob. The assistant grabbed my arm, holding it steady as they prepared to inject me with whatever horrors were in that syringe. As the needle pierced my skin, a wave of cold dread washed over me, followed by a searing pain that spread through my veins like wildfire. My vision blurred, tears streaming down my face as my body convulsed, every nerve ending on fire. The overseer watched, their expression unreadable as the serum took hold. My body began to tremble uncontrollably, my muscles spasming as the pain intensified. I could feel it working its way through me, altering me on a fundamental level, tearing me apart from the inside out. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the pain stopped. My body went still, the world around me fading into a dark, suffocating void. The last thing I heard was the overseer's voice, cold and detached, as they made a note on their clipboard. Another failure. Dispose of the body. This is the Curator. I hope you've enjoyed today's scary stories. Until next time.